So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Journal of American Studies Strand, The Talk. Our guest this installment is Gary Younge. Gary is one of the most incisive voices in contemporary journalism and political thought. A writer, broadcaster, and academic, his work has consistently interrogated power, race, democracy, and social justice with clarity, depth, and moral urgency. Over the course of his career, including many years as an award-winning columnist and editor at The Guardian, he has reported from around the world, bringing global context to issues often framed as local and human texture debates that are too easily abstracted. He is the author of several influential books, including Another Day in the Death of America and Dispatches from the Diaspora, and currently serves as Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you.
So I'm here with my colleague at the Journal of American Studies, and more importantly, my friend, Ahmed Honeini, and we'd like to ask you a few questions about your lecture publication, about social media, about the legacy media, and a few other topics. So are you ready for us?
I'm ready. Let's
All
go.
right then. All right then. So I'll start. I'd like to begin this Breakfast Club discussion with a look at the current militarized occupation of Minneapolis and other targeted American cities. I want to pull out of the weeds of our justified outrage and grief for a moment and talk about the shift from legacy media to more independent forms of journalism and those practicing it, such as Johnny on the spotters like Don Lemon, Georgia Fort, and W. Kamau Bell. The use of Substacks, alternative social media platforms like Blue Sky, and political blogs. How has the profession of journalism developed or perhaps devolved since the pandemic, in your opinion? And what does it mean to be a journalist today?
It's a good question, and I think that the role the role is always changing, and it's prime. I would say largely with the advent of social media, we saw. The journalist would never be the first person on the scene. Usually, there would be people on the scene, right? It's a bit like, well, we discovered America. Well, you didn't. There were people there. So there are always, but now those people get to amplify their witness, and and that puts a journalist, any kind of journalist, in a collaborative state that you are of the many sources that you have, there is now the source of the electronic crowd. I would argue that that's been accelerating since the beginning of the century, but the end of the last century with blogs, and then social media. And one of the things that can do is force journalists to account. I'll give you an example from at the very beginning of my reporting state period in America. There was oh God, now I'm blanking on his name. He was a senator from Mississippi, Trent Lott, and Trent Lott spoke at a commemoration for Strom Thurmond, at which he said something to the tune of, "We'd have all been better off if people had listened to him then," meaning in Strom Thurmond's segregationist runs for president, which I think were in 48, I think, and maybe there was another one, I don't know. And the legacy media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the people, they wrote this thing up, but they didn't include that. And it took a blogger to say, but what the hell has he just said? And then to kind of run with it. And outside of the legacy media, then people are like, yeah, that is crazy. And it ends up with Trent Lott resigning. And that wasn't the legacy media's doing. And the reality is that kind of for the longest time, and we're seeing this in Britain now with Peter Mandelson, and we are seeing it in the kind of the way that some of these um, press conferences are going at the White House, where the legacy media may not be on top of it ideologically, may not actually, because they're so close to power, because they feel the need to be close to power to get access, because quite often journalists actually think they are part of the power structure, almost like civil servants, or even the term the fourth estate, this notion that you also are a power structure, um, that they have other interests apart from or some may have other interests apart from just saying what happened and weeding out what happened, providing a context for what happened. And this kind of provides, because journalists, legacy journalists in particular, are most likely to come from a certain socioeconomic and racial demographic, then that translates into the kind of things that they see as being urgent or not. When I studied journalism, we were told, when a man bites a dog, when a dog bites a man, that's not a story. There are no women in these aphorisms. But when a man bites a dog, it's a story. And sooner or later, you have to ask yourself who owns these dogs. Like the fact that when George Floyd was murdered, the Minneapolis Police Department put out a statement that no journalist would have followed up. We were arresting a guy and he got tasty and, unfortunately he died of a heart attack. It took the video of the, as you called them, I think it was a Jane on the spot, not a Johnny on the spot. But
Yes.
if you think about it, George Floyd's murder was not news in a conventional sense. It wasn't rare. It wasn't particular. It wasn't new. What was new was that people paid attention. And one may say, well, there was a video, but there have been other videos that haven't done that. We don't quite know why these things go viral, what the alchemy is that makes them go viral. But it was
Mm.
actually precisely the fact that a black man being murdered by the state wasn't news that made it go viral. They're doing this again. This is part of our
Mhm.
experience, Nicole.
Mhm. Mm. Gary, if I may, what about the snuff film quality of it? The I'm watching
Yeah,
somebody being killed live
yeah,
aspect. I think
yeah.
that was also kind of a morbid curiosity there, if I may.
There is definitely that, and it's why I've never watched the video.
You
Um,
haven't.
no, I haven't. I don't need to see that. I've seen it described. That'll do for me. But um, it then present. I've not watched the Alex Prey video either. I've seen the Renee Good video, but that was because I saw it before I knew what I was seeing, and it didn't actually have all of the grotesque elements in the video. You had to kind of know what was going on. You didn't actually see her being, well, you saw her being shot, but you saw it from the other side. But my point is that kind of the legacy media weren't going to do it, and to some degree, they couldn't do it. Right? They couldn't do it quite like that because they wouldn't have been there. Why would they have been there? Um, and Um, but it does speak to something. It speaks to the degree to which some things that are unacceptable are accepted by people with proximity to power. I think is how the Epstein thing grew. And oh yeah, no, they've gone to the Epstein. You know what they're like, and that class. Let's call it an Epstein class, and I'm really talking about the multimillionaire, billionaire. There are journalists with their eyes at the window, kind of thinking, if I can get in there, I can find things out. But those power structures always consume them much more than they are seduced. They are seduced by it all. So, um, so it's an important thing on the one hand to potentially have all these eyes and ears out there. Trouble is, one of the things that comes or should come with legacy journalism is some training. What is appropriate? What's not appropriate? What's okay to say about someone? What's not? When do you reveal someone's identity? When do you not? How do you contextualize this information? When is it cogent to um, add political context? What's commentary? What's news? What's reporting? All of those things legacy are supposed to have been trained in. Now, I'm not saying that they always get that right. They don't. But the degree to which, for example, if when I go to my hometown to cover the election in 2019, my hometown of Stevenage, I want Labour to win. There's no surprise there. I'm a commentator. I've written about this. I kind of and I was a columnist. There's no surprise there. But I cannot wear a Labour badge. I have to identify myself as a journalist. I have to keep my distance in order to do this properly. And actually, I find that declaring your bias is actually more useful than pretending you don't have one. But there are still rules. I don't tend to. There's a there is a significant, quite um, uh, popular, prominent example to the contrary here, which is my engagement with Richard Spencer. But generally speaking, I don't argue with the people that I'm interviewing. That's how I could interview so many Republicans in America. And my job was to inquire and to discover and to say, why do you think that? And not to say, that's wrong, right? I mean, um, so, and that can be challenging. Actually, it did become very challenging. The longer I was in America, the less America I looked at it through an anthropologist's eye, and the more I felt implicated in it, and the harder it came to actually be a foreign correspondent there. Which is why, generally speaking, one of the reasons, cost is another, why foreign correspondents are usually only sent for 4 or 5 years, because they go local. And I was there for 12 years.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, if I may, another pernicious effect or knock-on effect or unintended consequence of being a journalist, uh, that over-implication, that over-involvement, that lack of objectivity is you do skew towards a certain perspective and create an information silo without
mm,
even realizing it, which is why I moved away from legacy media after the 2024 elections because I realized that, these, uh, I realized that, for example, the liberal legacy media was sure, oh, Kamala, no problem. That's, yes, she's going to win. And there was all this star power and all this
mm,
reporting. But the legacy media that I tended to plug into was not plugged into the manosphere, was not plugged into MAGA, and to the
mm,
soccer moms, and that the soccer moms weren't voting for themselves themselves, but rather for their sons, right? They weren't plugged
Mm.
into any of that. So they did not see this big red wave coming. And I felt
Yeah.
that that was so short-sighted. And I thought, I'm not watching the right, I'm not listening to the right people, right?
Mm. Well, yeah, and we had that in Britain with Brexit, and we had it with the first Trump election, where there was journalists skew liberal, they do, um, and but there was a both among liberals and establishment conservatives, there was this contempt which got in the way of their curiosity. We know who they are. We know what they think. We know why they do this. And this notion that their job was to predict the future rather than describe the present. That I saw this because I also saw a lot with Corbyn, and the arguments that I make about journalism and Corbyn are the same arguments I would make about journalism and Brexit and journalism and Trump, which is a chronic lack of curiosity, a sense of almost moral superiority over the people that you're covering, and a contempt for them, and a assumption that you are right and that this will be proved, that your job is to predict the future. And um, if I just a brief digression of being when I first came back from the States in 2015, Corbyn had just been made Labour leader. And I went to a cocktail party at The Economist, and this woman said to me, "Well, Labour have lost Corbyn's lost the election." And I said, "No, he just won an election." And she said, "I'm talking about 2020." And I said, "Are you talking about 2020 in the future?" And she said, "Well, we know what's going to happen." And I said, "Well, I don't know what's going to happen." I said, see, did you predict that the Tories would win the 2015 election?" And she said, "Well, I knew they'd be the biggest party." And I said, "That's not why I asked." She said, "No." I said, "Did you see that Corbyn would be the leader of the Labour Party last year? Did you predict that?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, then maybe you're not very good at predicting things. Maybe you should stop doing that and you should start looking at the world that we see rather than the one that you imagine." And so there is an arrogance. There has been an arrogance, and time again, they have illustrated that they don't understand the world that they're covering. Now, you know, I wouldn't have predicted that Corbyn would have been leader of the Labour Party. That would seem like the weirdest thing to me. I didn't think that um, we would leave the European Union. I didn't think on balance that Trump would win, but in 2016. But I never predicted that they would. I never predicted the opposite. I never said, well, this isn't going to happen. I worked on the basis that my job isn't to do that. It's to look, so it's not like I was walking around with any great powers of foresight. But what I did have was a power of observation. And that is the power that journalists need. We are in
Well, if
very
I may, I
volatile
have to,
times.
I just want to cut you off there for just a second, if I may, and get my word in on this, because I found reading your work that you have, maybe it's not deliberate, but you've tripped over being prescient about many a topic. And I've already talked to you about this in another interview, that because that curiosity um, seemed ahead of its time, rather. So you might not have intended to predict certain things, but you certainly, your curiosity has led you to places that the rest of your readers have just caught up to, or caught up to much later. So I'll just say that.
Well, I mean that's kind, and I would hope what you hope is that the people you're talking to reflect something that is meaningful. It's just not, it's often just not possible to know how meaningful it's going to be. But I remember being in Muncie, Indiana, before 2016, and sitting down with a group of Trump voters, and them saying everything. There was nothing that liberals said about Trump that they didn't see. They didn't like him particularly, but they um, but they would say, "I've got some liberal friends. I have friends who were liberals. They're not bad people, but oh my God, when they start to talk about Hillary, they lose their shit." And I was like, "Oh God, that is exactly what the other group is saying about you, actually." And that kind of uh, so there was just a sense that like I did get a sense that calling him names, saying that he is uncouth, saying where he kind of it was all true and you could all say it, but it's not like they hadn't seen it. It was that, and then I had to figure out, well, what's going on here? And what my view in that moment was, well, there's been a shift in expectation about what they want from a president. That my memory of Clinton was, it's a character thing, and the president was a person that you wanted to have with George Bush, it was the guy you wanted to have a beer with, and Obama was the guy you wanted to have a carpool with, and now character had been taken out of the equation, and people were saying, I wouldn't let him near my daughters, but I'll vote for him. And now in the past that would have felt disqualifying. So the stakes have changed. Now, but I couldn't tell you what that would mean in terms of vote count and vote weighing and all of that. Um, but you'd have to go and ask, and you'd have to shut up and listen, and then go away and think about it to sort of not think when what was it, the video comes of him saying it, grabbing women by the pussy, to think, wow, he's lost it now. That I didn't think that, because I'd already that was already felt like it was priced in. So um to come back to your original question, th- there can be wisdom in crowds, and there is certainly witness in crowds. The things that we've seen, the fact that we know, the fact they did it before our eyes, if we're talking Rene Good and Alex Preddick, is because people were there and they documented and they amplified. Um, but that, to my mind, that makes them witnesses, not journalists. And what comes next in order to be a journalist is to marshal a series of um, talents, abilities, training, call it what you will, storytelling, prioritization, um, weighing commentary against um, against news, all of those things. They are the things that would shift you from a witness to a journalist. Not all legacy journalists do that, and some people who bear witness do that.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to go on to a shameless plug of your new publication, Pigeonholed Creative Freedom as an Act of Resistance. So, Robin D. G. Kelly's 2009 Harmsworth lecture entitled He's Got the Whole World in His Hands, U.S. History and Its Discontents in the Obama Era was published in the Journal of American Studies in 2011. In contrast, your inaugural Faber lecture delivered in London in 2025, which became Pigeonholed Creative Freedom as an Act of Resistance, was published in paperback form in May of 2025. So maybe I'm overthinking this, but was publishing your lecture in this more accessible form an act of resistance? And Who are you talking to in this publication?
It's a very good question, and um, it wasn't an act of resistance; it was an act of marketing. Is the truth that Faber decided that they would have these that they would stage his annual lectures, which does make sense. Thank you. Which does make sense. They have access to all these writers. Some of these writers are also talkers. And they very kindly, I was very honored, I was asked to do the inaugural lecture. The timing of this is very important because they asked me in 2019. And I, because sorry, they asked me in 2024. And I thought about it a lot. Interestingly, given what is in the uh, uh, lecture, and it was always the intention that the lecture would then be published, and it feels like a sort of 19th century pamphlet to me. And I gave the speech at the Conway Hall in London, which was I think it's very clever piece of, you can put it in your pocket. It's £8. There's a couple of coffees. Some people go, this. It's like, yeah, we're living in a state of permanent attention deficit. So, like, this is a book you can, like, be happy. But I thought, given it was Faber, um, that I would engage with a challenge that I've had my whole life, including thinking what to write for the Faber lecture was, well, I might write about this, what it's like to be the burden of representation as a Black writer, as a minoritized writer. And then my next feeling was, is there something not about race that maybe I could write? I mean, I am interested in lots of things. It always fits. So I had that internal conversation in my head, and which I always do. Am I, is there something I'm missing? Am I getting on my hobby horse? But this was kind of, I wrote it because it felt like uh, selling some scores with a professional lifetime of challenges. Why are you always writing about that? You should never write about race. You should only write about race. You're the race man. You're the Guardian's affirmative action high. Why did you get this job? Why were you sent to South Africa? Obama's your story. For my whole life, um, and trying to navigate professional life and trying to navigate as someone who is interested in race and thinks that race is important, but who studied French and Russian as their degree and had wanted to be the Moscow correspondent before I fell in love with America and went the other way. So um, it felt to me like this was an appropriate, and of course, it wasn't just limited to race and so on. What I will say is that I don't regret that theme. Had I had to submit that lecture even 2 months later, I would have done something completely different because,
Really?
I delivered it when I was asked to do it. The election was going on in America. When I delivered it, it was maybe 2 weeks before the inauguration. And I wasn't quite prepared for the hellscape that came afterwards. And I didn't think that Trump was going to be good, don't get me wrong. But masked men shooting dead white citizens in the street I hadn't quite seen that scale of dystopia coming. Um, uh, and if I'd had to deliver it 2 months later, I would have called the editor and said, look, I have to write about the role of writers in moments of crisis. The connection, which had been by far my lower down, my second choice was something about writers and movements. And
Um,
but this, I felt that the role of a journalist, the role of a writer in this moment when democracy is being stripped bare before our eyes in such a kind of brazen way that I would have chosen differently. Like I said, I don't regret the choice that I made, but uh, it didn't feel urgent in the way that the other thing. That's that's mostly what I've
Yeah.
been thinking about all year,
Yeah, I
and
hear you.
and that's okay. Like, there's nothing to stop me writing another essay. It wouldn't be an inaugural Faber lecture, but nothing to stop me doing that. But
Well,
sorry,
I'm sorry, but I just have to say, I know we're in a journalistic mode, but again, your job wasn't to predict uh, or to describe the moment necessarily, but to write about what concerns you. And I have to say, on the reader side of things, honestly, I thought this
mm,
essay had the same authenticity, hear me out, as Ryan Coogler's Sinners. Because in the sense, yes, in the sense that it explores what it means to be Black and those subtle and not so subtle tests that we have to endure on a daily basis, being
mm,
first, only, and different. And that is not, you didn't pander to the moment, but
mm,
you talked about a subject that honestly does not get discussed at all by people in positions that you have, or people in power positions don't discuss this necessarily. So it was important and it still is. And again, you have time to get back to the rise of authoritarianism and all of that. But this subject, I think, has its own importance and its own place, certainly for the minority communities like us who need to see ourselves in works from renowned
mm.
authors like yourself. We need to see that, and we need to talk about the authoritarian stuff that's going to come later, but or that was actually unfolding. Trump was very clear what he was going to do. We knew about Project 2025. Yes, he said he was going to be a dictator on one. Yes, but we had to see. I think we had to really see
Yeah.
that a little bit more. So I think, yes, there's urgency in that, but this subject is still nonetheless very important and needed to be discussed.
So Nick,
So,
I don't regret it. I don't regret it, and for me, it has value, and it engaged, and I feel that I hope it might be of use in terms as as people come come through. To I I wasn't the first to face those challenges, and I won't be the last. And so I don't regret it. I just the 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 timing was peculiar, and I wrote it for I think for kind of Black people in any kind of creative world, who um and I hope that its resonance goes beyond that actually, but certainly writers, filmmakers, intellectuals, academics, uh, musicians, anybody who has felt that pressure to perform certain kinds of blackness in certain ways, which I think is probably all Black people, and and I do think that for the book to resonate, it's not difficult to translate to other underrepresented groups, including women, gay folk, um, uh, anyone who's underrepresented.
okay. So Ahmed, any reactions
Yes,
to what Gary said so far?
so I was fascinated by the idea of sort of the voices that are inconvenient and that you sort of that and the perspectives that are inconvenient that you sort of silence and put to one side because I see that there's a version of what happened in 2016 with Brexit and with Trump happening as we speak with Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, that we are sort of as a country we are careening towards a very possible outcome where Nigel Farage is prime minister, and I think that that would be absolutely disastrous. And I think that there's a sense that people aren't actually realizing that that could be a very viable possibility, and people need to start realizing that yes, it could be. And I think that that's something that is speaks very directly to what Gary has been mentioning at the with regards to legacy media. And yeah, so I think that's yeah, that's a very important point to consider.
Well, when he comes back, I know you've got some questions you want to ask, some of which has been partially answered, but I think it's important that you specifically ask anyway, because I think there's more to say about the topics that you want to
Sure.
address with him. But I'm surprised, you and I thought that 2 hours wasn't going to be
Hmm.
too long, and well, like I said, I had no worries about that. I think he's
Now,
got
sure.
such an amplified and complex view of things, that is unexpected in both unexpected and welcome. There's a layer of complexity to his understanding of what journalism is that I just, well, it comes out obviously in
Mhm.
in this discussion, as it were. But yeah, so this is quite interesting. I mean, I know you weren't expecting me to pull out that Sinners reference.
No, no.
I-
Actually, no,
um
I kind of was eventually, considering how much you like it, but it was very clever, very, very imaginative. The sort of
well,
the yeah.
you know what, as you, after reading, I thought, okay, what's my impression? What comes out immediately after my second reading? Because I got this version,
Mhm.
and then we got PDF versions, but then coming back to it, I just kept thinking about Sinners. I mean,
Mhm.
and obviously, prima facie, there's no connection between journalism uh um and Ryan Coogler's film, which is, by the way, you can't even pinpoint. We're still looking for a word for what that film was. Is it horror? We're still not sure what happened. We
Mhm.
love it, but we don't know what it is. We haven't been able to pinpoint that yet. We haven't been able to pigeonhole the film.
No,
That's an interesting
no, that's a
perspective,
very
but
good. No, that's a very good perspective, and it. So some people say, well, it's just a vampire movie, but it's not. It's not just a vampire movie. It's much more. It's much richer than that. And I think that sort of the people that try to dismiss it as just, another sleazy horror movie, they're not doing it because of the film on its own merits. They're doing it because, frankly, they don't like the subject matter, and they don't like that it has a predominantly African American cast. That's what it boils down to. It boils down to prejudice, and I think that says more about the people that dismiss it than it does about the actual strengths and beauties of the film. And so I think, yeah, I think, it as I think it's a masterpiece. So I don't share that opinion, and I just think that you're right. You can't pigeonhole it. You can't sort of say it is one thing and it is another. It's a beautiful, rich tapestry, I think. You know.
yeah, and I think the aspect that here's we're rebutting Gary back in.
Sorry
Hi,
about that.
Gary. Yeah, we were just talking about Ryan Coogler's film and the parallels between your work and the film, on a more complex level. Obviously, uh, his work, the genre that it's difficult to pigeonhole the film Sinners into a specific genre. And I was making the point also about creative freedom and the search for authenticity. Um, so anyway, we were just making parallels and just continuing the discussion as you were finding your way back to us
Mm. That's,
digitally. But Ahmed has a question. Ahmed,
uh,
I'm going to let you take the floor, been gabbing on.
Well, thank you so much, Gary. This has been very enlightening and very sort of just not even as a sort of a member of the interviewing team, just as somebody listening in. I've been very intrigued by what you've had to say, and I was also fascinated when I was reading the lecture about a point you raised about the burden of as a journalist to either only write about race and nothing else, or that you should never write about race under any circumstances. And I've experienced a version of that myself as a literary critic from a Middle Eastern background. I'm Lebanese and Syrian. And people often wonder when they look at my CV, they see Faulkner, they see Nabokov, they see Tennessee Williams, they see James Baldwin. They don't see any Arab American or post-colonial literature, and they're very taken aback, sort of why don't you write about these topics? And my answer is sort of similar to what you mentioned, because I write what I want. I do my own thing, and I was wondering, speaking from from your position as an academic, if you'd experienced a similar kind of burden as an academic, as a scholar.
So I haven't. That may be because I've only been in that role for 5 years. It may also be because I brought a lot of expectations with me. It may also be because I do write about race a lot, not only, but so to that extent, it can be more comfortable for people. But I I feel like it is a constant and consistent feature of minoritized life, which is, what are you here for? What do we want you for? And this notion that your role is to be some kind of griot and to stay in your lane. And one of the things that's interesting for me is that it often comes from the very same people who will say, um, white writers can write black characters, and and we'll talk about freedom in the kind of most abstract and obnoxious terms, but it's not freedom for you. It's not freedom for me. We have, through our identities are supposed to be our expertise. And so the moment I start talking about Brexit or Corbyn or things that are not, to me, they're all about the same thing. I don't find it particularly complicated. I don't feel like I'm code switching when I write a column about, I don't know, Bosnia or something, and then, Russia, and then I write something, but that we are, and in a sense, maybe me and you will be polar opposites in that perception. So your thing will be like, you should write more about the stuff that you know because you expect, whereas mine is like, don't write about stuff you don't know. And they're all forms of control. They're all about, nobody is ever saying that was good or that was bad, or here's an issue that I have with your position on Faulkner, or here's why I think this is not just they're just saying do or don't. And nobody else has that. Or nobody else. All minoritized people have that. But the more powerful you are, the more the sense is that you are all knowing and all seeing, and you can do whatever you want. And it's an important thing to insist upon,
That's
really,
it.
both ways.
That's it precisely, Gary. Yes, because it seems almost as if the goalposts and the field of play is constantly changing. That no matter if you sort of, no matter what you do, no matter which position you play, it's never enough, and it's always sort of well, if you did ABC, why didn't you do D, E, and F? And it's a
Yeah.
sort of it's well, you minoritized people can't win for losing, really, and it
No.
gets very demoralizing, shall we say, to
Yeah.
sort of just
Well,
to yeah.
Yeah, well, and to me, that is the resistance. That is the act of resistance, is to insist on your freedom, to insist on your intellectual freedom, to say, yeah, this is what I want to write about. You don't want to read it, go read something else. But that, and not to, and I've seen this a lot um, with younger journalists in particular, um, because that was the field I was in, to give their freedom to somebody else, to an unknown entity, to say, I don't want to be thought of as. And it's like, well, who's doing the thinking? What do you think about yourself and your own work? Like the things that you do best. I always tell younger journalists, you want to write about fashion? Black journalists, write about fashion. You want to write about sport? Write about sport. Do the things that you are passionate about because they're the things that you are likely to do best whenever you can. And you know what? You'll still be black. You will still be bringing your perspective with you. The 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 challenge, the resistance is to do the things you want to do, obviously within the parameters of like keeping your job and all of that, is and to dismiss the gaze that is, of the of behind the dead eyes of the unknown person who's saying, yeah, we don't really want you for that. And to the not even the risk, the fact of being solipsistic, that's kind of how I got here. I've came from a working class family, single parent mom. If I'd submitted myself to other people's gaze, I wouldn't be doing this. I'd be doing something else. There was nobody who thought, oh, there goes a professor and a national journalist when I was younger. So the degree to which we rely on self-authorship, we shouldn't just abandon that at a certain moment. But it is something that you have to fight for and that you have to fight about. And at times it means walking away from, like, you know what? I refuse to fit into that box that you have designed for me.
Gary, isn't this what Toni Morrison meant by that, what she describes as willful defiance?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of and Audre Lorde has a kind of a quote that's very similar. That's like, if you submit yourself to other people's plans, then you just, it's better than that. But
which,
that is
which
kind of
is
what it
all
means.
which is also incredibly cruel because you have this sense in, with hiring committees, with people that do gatekeep, that sort of, well, if you're not playing by the rules that I've set you, I'm going to limit your career progression. And
Mm,
it gets very, so for example, I've always said that if I were to write about Arab American literature, it would be much easier to find a permanent job than it would be the position that I've taken. But at the
mm,
same time, it's just not what I want to do. So do I sacrifice essentially my integrity to sort of
mm,
get the to sort of get to the top, as it were, or do I
mm.
kind of sort of write what I want to write about? And I think that's sort of it's the path of least resistance isn't always the best path to take, I think. And I think
No.
I think sort of that links very nicely to what you've
Mm.
been saying throughout this whole conversation.
But there's an important element in there which, uh, it would be irresponsible, and I would feel like a charlatan not to emphasize, which is that there is a cost to this, and that we have to be strategic, actually. That kind of, I am not going to claim that I fought every battle, that I won every battle, that there weren't stories that I did that I didn't want to do. But I mean, there are some clearly there are lines that have been drawn. I used to have a thing sometimes at the Guardian when they would make me. There was one good example of um, Chris Eubank had a cab hadn't stopped for him, and he'd kicked the cab, and there was some ruckus about it, and they said, Gary, will you write this thing about black people and cabs? Not an unreasonable request, but I had written about that already. I'd already done a column about that. And I said, no, I've already done that. And, you need to get someone else to do that. And they insisted. And it was really unpleasant. I don't want to, I don't want to over exaggerate what not getting a cab can mean in this description. But if a woman had had a experience of sexual harassment and you insisted that they wrote about it, is that right? If they say, "Oh, I've already done that," or "I don't want to write," it's not the same thing, but it is them leveraging my experience as a black person when they don't have other black people. It's their problem. It's not my problem. And I did it, and I did it because line of command. I made my arguments. I bitched and I moaned, I did it. I did then take the next 2 days off for what I call race tax, and I didn't phone in. I didn't say I was sick. I didn't use it as a sick day. I just didn't come. And you know, at a less kind place, I might have been fired. But there is a price that you pay, and you don't win every battle. And that we want people to be here doing good thought. We're not raising hashtags for slaughter. So at certain points, you're going to walk away. And at certain points, you're going to comply. And as is always the case with anyone who's trying to be strategic, you're never going to get it 100% right. Sometimes you will not do the fight, and that will be kind of somewhat cowardly. It may be that and there are other times when you'll go in too hard over the top, and it won't be necessary. But that um, I wouldn't want anybody to come away from this or any of the other things that I've done and think, oh, he just went and just told the man like straight away. Like the reason I'm here at 57 to tell these stories is because I was strategic. And you don't always know that you're going to get it right. And sometimes the very first, I was an intern. So it wasn't even a job. I was going to say very first job. I was on a international affairs magazine program for the Channel 4. Channel 4. I was an intern, very poorly paid. I was there because I had language abilities. I speak French. I studied French. I was asked to call the Front National, as was then Le Pen's party, and it was right at the end of my probation period. And I took a long walk around the block, and was just like, I'm just not going to do that. They were polling at like 7 or 8%. It was for titillation, I think, to show that they were clever. If they wanted to do it, they were going to have to do it themselves. And I had no leverage. The only leverage I had was that I was so poorly paid that, like, well, what are you going to do? Like, dog my wages? Like, you know. But and it did take courage. It did take courage. I was 24. And but I went into the executive and I said, look, I'm sorry, I can't do this. These are the reasons why I think it's a bad idea. I do understand. I was a Trotskyist at 15. I got kicked out when I was 16, but I understand the line of command. And I said to him, I understand that you can fire me or you could just stop this as a probationary period. So I get that. And I'm not going to do it. And my feeling was, as I walked around the block, which I literally walked around the block, it was there was a square where I was. It was in Holborn. Was if this is where I start, where am I going to finish? And I have to live with myself. And I'd rather work for Burger King. I'd rather work at Burger King and wait for my turn. If this is what it's going to take, I want to do it.
Question though, Gary. But today, given the fact that Marine Le Pen has basically been sidelined due to legal issues, and Bardella is the candidate to beat, if someone approached you as a and asked you to comment on Bardela's position now in France and the possibility that the Front National will come to power, given Macron's poor performance and other
Mm.
issues, would you write that story?
I think it's a different. I honestly think it's a different issue now that we can't
Mm,
avoid them now. At
mm,
the time, there was no need to give them a platform. It was unnecessary politically, electorally. It did not make sense. I I feel that um, if I was asked to do the same thing now, I I I think that there would be good grounds to make the call. Um, I think it's partly because of how the media and others behaved then. Partly that we're in a situation that we're in now, but it was a balance of forces argument, and my argument was this is what they're polling. They are not a major force. There is no need to give these people a platform. Now they have a platform, and it's an electoral platform. And how do if you extrapolate an abstraction of the argument that I made, you'd say, well, we're never going to interview Trump. Well, I think, people in power have to be held to account. And now they have power. So, but then they didn't. So I don't feel that it's an argument I would make now, and I think it is an argument. I don't think I'm not claiming it as a morally fixed position. Um, uh, in the same way that if you remember when BNP were on Question Time, when Nick Griffin was on Question Time, and for me the issue was that he had been elected. Once he was elected, at a certain point it becomes difficult to avoid. And actually, at a certain point, it becomes necessary to debunk. Now, I don't know at that point, I don't know how, I think that they only had a couple of MEPs. Um, but at that point, he represented something. And my feeling was wherever he is, people should demonstrate. Wherever he speaks, people should demonstrate. But I don't know that in this particular case, that the BBC were wrong to have him on. It was a tough call, I think, but that it wasn't the BBC that gave him the platform. The electorate and the political culture had given him the platform, and at a certain point, pretending that these people don't exist is not the answer. You have to hold them to account. It's a tough
yes,
call,
yes.
but I'm happy to admit that, like, you're not always going to get it right. But I felt comfortable in that moment. But my
Yeah.
bigger point, Ahmed, is there is a price to pay when you do this, when you insist on your freedom, as is always the case, right? Whether you're an artist or a laborer and you go on strike or you insist on certain things, if you know you're a woman and you insist on certain things, either at home or at work, there's a price to pay. And we shouldn't pretend like the people that get through it haven't been have done so through chutzpah alone,
Mm,
because
mhm,
it's dishonest.
mhm.
Ahmed, do you want to ask another question here?
Sure. Yes, Gary, that's fantastic. And yes, there are compromises that sort of as uncomfortable as they might appear to be, either have to be made or strictly can never be made. And I think that
Mm,
that's a very fine line to draw. And I was also drawn to you mentioned James Baldwin's failed promise to the Howard University students to never betray them by
mm,
accepting any of the many derogatory, degrading, and reductive definitions that society has ready for them.
mm.
And you've laid out, in miniature, what some of the reasons why such a promise is doomed to fail. But I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. And this might be a bit spicy, but have any other writers failed to honor the same kind of promise? And sort of feel free to sort of demur on that side of the question if you wish.
The element that I thought he could never deliver on, I think it's really important not to misrepresent people, right? And that the quote that you gave, where he's saying, "I'm not going to misrepresent you," that I think you can deliver on that. But to say, "I will always champion you," well, you also, while it's important to not misrepresent people, you also don't represent people, right? And he actually does say that. Like, nobody's elected him. He's accountable to no one. And he has to kind of engage with the fact that at certain points they may either do something he doesn't approve of, or make a decision that he thinks in some ways wrong, or have an argument amongst themselves, in which case it's like, well, betray who? So I think Edward Said with the Oslo Accords, where he splits from the movement. And I think, that is the role and the challenge of the intellectual and the movement, for want of a better word, that you're no use to them as a cheerleader, as a you're no use to them as a spokesperson. You are used to them as a critic, and as a and offering, it may be offering critical support, it may be offering them critical negativity. It may, but that just to be like, tell me what to say. Do you know what I mean? Or show me the way, and then I will parlay that. Then you're a propagandist, and there is role for propaganda. There is absolutely role for propaganda. We're dealing with propaganda all the time, but if that's your role, say it's your role. But if you're a writer and a critic and an intellectual, that is not the same as being a propagandist. And that actually, the sharper the crisis, the more urgent the need for critical thinkers. Just to, what are we doing here? What do we want here? The Robin Kelly lecture that you mentioned, he steps away from the rah-rah, from the "isn't this wonderful," from the symbolic euphoria of Obama's election, to say, well, let's talk about what's happened here, and let's talk about what's necessary and what's. And I remember during Obama's, when he was running, and my thing was not a million miles away from Robin Kelly's kind of analysis. Was, look, this is not a movement; it's an election, and for the people who are involved now to make sense, they're going to have to keep moving once he's elected. Once he's elected, he becomes not change, but power. And then he's not going to organize the left opposition to himself. You shouldn't expect him to. He will be faced with bankers and powerful people and military people. And if there's nobody on the other side to keep him honest, what do you think he's going to do? And I remember somebody below the line, in the comments of The Guardian said, kind of, they called me Eeyore, and they said I was like a buzzkill, and I thought, yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, I'm here to kill your buzz. I'm here to kind of, not as a principle, but yeah, by all means, let's be happy. Let's enjoy the symbolism of this moment, but let's not pretend it's not symbolism. Let's not confuse symbol and substance, because that will come back and bite us on the arse. And so I feel, that very urgently. I'm no longer a columnist, and I enjoy the fact that I don't have to have an idea every Thursday, whether I want one or not. But when I see what's going on in the Labour Party at the moment, I think, and this is, about Britain, but it speaks to other things. There's a great quote from Camus about, like, before 1789, people would often talk about getting rid of the king, but not royalty. So there would just be another king. And that's the way I feel at the moment. There is sharp discussion. I don't know when this is going out. There is sharp and keen discussion about Keir Starmer and his future. And I think it's not a change of personnel we need, it's a change of policy and direction. Get rid of him, get another person. We got rid of Boris, we got Rishi Sunak, we got rid of Sunak, we got rid of. Like, can we stop doing the musical chair thing? It's not an argument for Starmer staying or going,
Mm.
but it is a desire to redirect the conversation. I did, it was a provocation, but I wasn't just showing off in 2021, where I said, look, why don't we get rid of all the statues? What use are they? What do they do? Do we actually, are they really effective ways to remember people? And when I say all the statues, yeah, I mean Mandela as well, and Mary Seacole, and but they wouldn't be my first statues to get rid of. But do can we stop talking about, like, how many Churchills does it take to make a Mandela, or why isn't there this statue of Gandhi, or what are we doing with this thing? Do we actually, is it that what we want are more statues of black people and women? In which case, how are we going to get about the city, frankly? Uh, or is the argument that actually these things don't work and we need to think of better ways to remember people? And that was me. You could say betraying a group of people who I care deeply about, who are trying to get different statues for things that they care about, and trying to inject a different kind of argument. I think that's our job. And so we can't worry too much about being popular. It comes back to the point, Nicole, about kind of at a certain point, I have to not care who's going to read it or what's going. I have to do it if I think it's urgent, and of course that's an indulgence, but that it's an important indulgence, because otherwise you end up kind of following the mood rather than engaging with it or even trying to set a new one. Um, so I I think that there were, in Baldwin's promise, there was a promise not to be critical, and um, and that in many ways, in that particular promise, and in many ways that would render him ineffective.
And we see a version of that now with what's happening with people trying to sort of cheerlead for Starmer and not realizing that in doing so, we are sleepwalking towards a potentially a reform government with Nigel Farage as our prime minister. And that, to me, would be a fate worse than death. So
Mm.
that's what I have to say about that. But thanks a lot, Gary.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I kind of think, and we can almost kind of spin it out from that to, first of all, um, the people who are emphasizing Starmer's got to go, and that is their own, is to say, look, can we, there's a different conversation we might have that would include him going, but is not the point. And and I said this when we were doing a podcast. I think I said this when I was doing a podcast, but like, I'd vote Tory against reform. If I lived in a place where reform might beat Tory, I'd vote Tory. I hate Tories. I actually wrote a piece called "I Hate Tories." That was the headline. I don't like, these are not my people, but there is a need to be strategic in this moment, and I'm not going to run around kind of saying to people, hey, I'm going to vote Tory, it's a wonderful thing. But like, now more than ever, we need these, we need to have these critical conversations. And I would be really happy to be, in a place where I could be corrected about that. and be kind of look, strategically that's not the right thing to do. Maybe you shouldn't even vote or whatever. I'm kind of but that um the basic point I'm trying to make is now more than ever we need critical minds. It was Baldwin who said, why, whenever there's a terrorist incident or whatever, people say like now is not the time for politics. They used to do that whenever there was a school shooting as well. Let's pray. And
Thoughts
and
and prayers.
yeah, and Baldwin said, why would I suspend my critical faculties at the very moment when they are most needed? And if ever they were needed now from all of us. And there are a range of ways in which we've seen some of this stuff before, particularly in America. There's a range of ways in which we haven't, because every situation is new. But we have to argue it out strategically. It could be there's a by-election coming up. It could be that we sleepwalk into a division of the vote that ends up with reform winning. None of us want that. So we have to think it through. And that means you have to be prepared to be vulnerable and be wrong. And that you have to kind of uh, you can't just say the things that you think people will like.
Mm. Yeah. Well, before I ask my next question, Gary, I just want to inform our viewers and listeners that the introduction to this discussion, your professional biography, was partially AI generated. A stark contrast to the introduction I wrote about you for the 2023 Radical Book Fair in Edinburgh, for which you were the keynote speaker. That text was based on my relationship with language. In that space, the space where I write, I often hear language as music. This other introduction was written from a place of empathy. However, an AI bot is incapable of understanding spatial reality or even feeling empathy. That said, could you discuss AI and its role in defining our reality, how we understand the facts today, and how this new paradigm will shape journalism and academia going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question and a real challenge. And I actually really remember your introduction at the Radical Book Fair because it was original, and you did a riff on a song. I remember.
Yes, I
Was it?
did.
Um, it wasn't Young
Young,
Gifted and
Gifted,
Black.
and Black.
Was it Young Gifted and Black? Okay, yeah.
Mm,
And and it was about you and me and my work, which is what we were going to talk about. I distinctly remember it because all too often what people do is they just do it from Wikipedia, and it wasn't that, um, and so that's the first thing about artificial intelligence, right? Is it's artificial, and that it's drawn from what we know. It's drawn from, well, not even what we know, from what is recorded. And therefore, it admits no new ideas. It can't. It's artificial. It can only take from what is and then assemble. And that makes it less than, much less than. It also makes it extremely convenient. And we've seen time and time again with any range of foods, series, um, art that people will settle for what is worse but easy as opposed to what is difficult and challenging. Now, if the world were right, then what would happen with AI is that a bunch of people who are in journalism, in academia, in the intellectual world, who really don't add very much because they come from the same demographic and space as 90% of the rest of that world. And they have very similar thoughts to the rest of that world. And then they produce very similar things to the rest of that world. The first two is no sin. It's the last one that's the sin. That they're not particularly original thinkers. They are convenient thinkers. And that they work within these very narrow paradigms, which we see time and time again, and it's why, going back to the previous part of the conversation, why the reporting on Brexit or Corbyn or Trump was so bad, because there was a song to sing and they all sang it. AI would get rid of them because we don't need them. They're all saying the same thing anyway within really narrow parameters, and it would promote more original thinking. We know that's not what's going to happen, right? We know that that isn't um, that that isn't going to be the product of the AI. What it's going to do is enforce a dominant received wisdom, but where nobody's going to produce the receipt. And that is what is really ugly about it. It takes all the received wisdom and then says Gary Younge writes about black stuff, or whatever it is. It takes my Wikipedia page, takes my bio, takes things that have been said about me on the internet and shoves it all together. So until the day before the story breaks, Peter Mandelson is a storied, wonderful man who is well connected in high society and a very powerful man in British politics. And the next day, he becomes a friend of a paedophile, and so, because it's just taking what's done, and that's really dangerous and really worrying. And I know from colleagues that students are producing these pieces of work that are, I want to say, fraudulent, but they are certainly not their own work and not their own thoughts. And that, I used to have I wasn't a natural reader as a child. I got into reading quite late, sort of 18, 19. And I remember at one stage thinking, if I could just take a pill, and that pill would mean that I'd read the book. I could just take the color purple pill, and then I would have read the book. Would I want that pill? Because there's more books in the world than I could ever read. And I remember just thinking, well, no, because the process of reading actually is transformative. That it's in the reading of it and the connection between what you're reading and what you see on that day and how you're feeling in that moment is part of a process. And that to short circuit that process is a bit like taking Monjaro or Ozempic. And it is very effective for weight loss. But most of the studies are showing that within 18 months, you put it back again. And that what you need to do is eat less. I'm speaking as a fat person here. You need to eat less and do more. And that is how you lose weight. And that all of the shortcuts, while they may be medically proven and they may be, that's what they are. They're shortcuts. And sooner or later, you have to go the long way round.
Well,
And
I'm sorry, Gary, sorry to cut you
mm,
off, but I just wanted to say, so when I was reading Dispatches from the Diaspora, my relationship with the book, I didn't read it like I would read a novel,
mm,
because it was uh, articles that you'd written previously. I allowed myself to take it in bits.
mm,
And I gave myself a lot of time to digest, to live with the book. And what jumped off the page, I always have my afterthoughts. What impression am I being left with after I read the book, right? And the impression that I got from that book was the love that at the very base of what you do, is the love and the relationship that you have with your mother. It
mm,
just jumped off the page at me, and I thought, okay, I want to gift Gary a space where he can be with his mother forever. In the hurricane of all the accomplishments, in all that, I said to myself, how am I going to do this bio? There's so many accomplishments here. How can I get all this together? And I said, well, don't look at it like that. Create a space and protect that space protect that love with all of the work that he's done. And that's when I was talking about all of the different articles that were in the book. That became the hurricane. And at the eye of the hurricane, why you write, why you do what you do for me was love. And that space could only be occupied by you and your mother together.
Mm.
So that
Well, that's very
AI
moving.
ain't doing that for you, honey.
No, well, that's yeah, and that's the
Yeah.
thing is that kind of, and there will be people who are like, I just want to know what he said. I just want to know what he said. You know, and that, and it's like a ready meal, you
Mm,
know, and they sell a lot of ready meals, and sometimes I buy them because I don't have time to cook. And so, and there is a real risk, though, that you end up with, we do have this, entire countries that are raising their kids on ready meals. And and AI is a very dangerous or potentially very dangerous form of that. I don't think it is per se dangerous, but it is, you know, how it's going to be used. So I trained to be a translator and an interpreter. That's what I studied. And I know that AI is now being used to just, you know, knock out translations. Now, there are some books, I just need to know what they say. And I don't need, you know, and that will be okay. And for that, AI will be very convenient. But I have to know that I'm losing something. I have to know that I'm getting a sense and all of that. But that I also know that translation, when it's done well, when it's done properly, is a human endeavor that involves, well, what is that person trying to say? What are they trying to evoke? What is that? Is that mist? Is it fog? Is it steam? You know, and the context is everything. AI can't do that. And so what we have the potential for technology, right? And then we have the fact of it. So the potential with technology would be machines do the work and produce things, and we all get a 6 hour day and and longer holidays, and everybody gets to work. But that's not what's happened, right? The machines do the work, and the people are laid off and are considered surplus to requirements. Similarly, with AI, there is the potential for there to be a real premium on originality, on the human, on on intellectual endeavor. But that's not what's happening. And that is, you know, we shouldn't assume that that is going to happen. Actually, we can already see it's not. And in a political world where people are telling you not to believe your own eyes, it also injects the possibility that you're not seeing what you think you see when it's online, that things are being constructed. There have been videos that I've seen that I thought, oh my God, and then thought, hang on, is that real? And
mm,
sometimes I don't even know.
mm,
Um, uh, and we're only at the beginning of this. Right?
mm,
So they're going to get much better at it. Um, and I guess Hannah Arendt talks about like the point of the big lie isn't that you believe the lie, so you stop believing anything. Well, AI is definitely injecting that into our culture, and we've seen the degree to which there is a credulous market for the belief of whatever people want to believe. That a phone is a gun. That a person driving a car away from someone is driving it into them. That that people who target pro-Palestinian protesters are actually in favor of freedom of speech. That we've seen the way in a range of ways that have nothing to do with AI that we are kind of living in this fantasy land. AI is going to make that worse and is already making it worse, I think. and is going to be a real challenge for us. And going back to your original question, we'll put a premium on some of those skills that journalists are supposed to have of making it clear to people why this is true and why something else isn't true.
This reminds me of a tweet I saw a while ago of a man bragging that he had read 25 classics of literature like Ulysses, Crime and Punishment, Count of Monte Cristo. And he was bragging that I didn't actually sit down and read them cover to cover. I had AI summarize them for me. And he was humiliated and sort of called to task. No, you haven't read any of these books because AI
Mm,
just gave you summaries of them. So
mm,
don't just sit there and tell me that you've read them. You haven't read them at all. And it's I don't usually you would brag about you legitimately would brag about sitting and reading,
mm.
something as complex as Crime and Punishment. And now it seems almost as if the inverse is true. And I don't get where the gulf between those two realities comes from.
Yeah, and in time that ridicule will diminish. So many other people will be doing that, and we won't be able to tell the difference. And you know, for the more tender-hearted of us, there will be a sense of like, "Shit, I wish I'd read those books. I knew I should read more." And the kind of and what one hopes, hope against hope, would be that there would be a premium on truth and authenticity. That's not the way things are panning out. And there's politics. There is politics in that. The degree to which we are constantly, both in Britain and in America, being asked not to believe our own eyes. It's not a
Um,
genocide. It's not this. It's not that. He's doing a brilliant job. They've saved the Labour Party. He had a gun. Even when we're seeing it, and that's even without AI. So we're in a very, very dangerous place in terms of polluted information sources.
well, I want to inject a little positivity into this discussion and say that authenticity is, in fact, as you say, something that is valued. You can see that, if I may, in the arts. Um, there are TV series, for example, if I may, Stranger Things.
Mm,
Where it's about kids growing up in the 80s
mm,
and how these kids, there's no mobile phones, and it's all
mm,
about imagination and connection. And, you know, they're not latchkey kids necessarily, but they know how to go out on the streets and, get through the day, get injured, show resilience because they're not, coddled and so forth. If I may, here we go.
mhm,
The Super Bowl halftime
mm,
was brilliant. Bad Bunny's Super Bowl halftime was so good because it was so authentic. It was so his experience, him bringing his culture as an American, because Puerto
mm,
Rico is part of America, but in the sense that the Puerto Ricans are American citizens. Him bringing his authentic experience as American to such a well, should we say, untraditional
mm.
venue, yeah. So and it did so well. I mean, business wise, and the general impression of the the show was very positive. So I think it's still authenticity, moving towards the real, understanding what's real and important and true, still has a value, at
Oh
least for the
God, yeah.
moment.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Oh no, people I think yearn for it. And um in the same way that people who have ready meals love a good cooked steak or whatever. Like it's and it's interesting the examples that you give because you're right, and it takes place urgently in the place of culture, right? In the place of culture where you know I don't want to dance to Kid Rock, but I do want to dance to Bad Bunny, and where I don't want to watch Melania, but I do want to watch something else. So that kind of, and that's the point. You can fake it, but that's the point at which, like, the truth is out in terms of like what people enjoy, what they don't enjoy, what they find funny. There are some people to see the hard right in America lose their minds over this halftime show is kind of funny, but it's also instructive, right? These are people who believe in free speech and who say they're against cancellation, but they want to cancel this guy, and who don't even know what they're seeing. So I think it was Laura Loomer I saw say, to think, he climbs up that thing, that pole, and, Puerto Rico's, he should be highlighting the fact that Puerto Rico has got no electricity, and instead he's dancing on this. It's like, lady, that's exactly what he was doing, actually. Um, that
That was the point.
yeah, yeah, and
Uh,
and to see them lose at the point of culture, of like, yeah, you might not like it, but we're all dancing to it. And there's joy in this moment, and they
indeed,
hate the
indeed.
idea of joy,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and that's really important, and it speaks to part of the function of Pigeonhole, what I'm trying to do there, but also to, I don't want to say how we win, because I think that's a kind of nonsense term in a way. Win what? And win
Mm,
against whom? And win with whom? And so on. But
mm,
it is one of the ways. We're not going to beat this with song and dance alone. I know that. They've got guns. I'm not saying that we should have guns, but like, there is hardware involved in this battle.
mm.
But that it is in part a battle for culture, and a battle about culture. Donald Trump was produced by the culture. You're fired, all of that. That's where people knew him from. They knew him from
Yes,
TV. They didn't know him specifically as a businessman, but as a performer.
right.
Um, and and so that's not the only place where we need to be. We need to be on the factory floor. We need to be in communities. We need to be in a range of places, but that we are all in different ways cultural practitioners, and we have a role in this fight. Um,
Well, if I may, I think another space that's really important that I'm a part of is the resist and unsubscribe movement. It's a consumer and economic boycott initiated early February of
mm,
2026 by Scott Galloway. And it's a way that the average Joe can have an impact and say, I don't like ICE policies or ICE practices at the moment. I don't like the way that that's being weaponized against local communities of color and not, your average citizen.
mm,
So the way that the average citizen can be a part of a protest against that and other problems with big tech and,
mm,
is to unsubscribe from certain companies uh, and to resist by, doing an economic boycott, which worked so well before, as we
mm,
know from the civil rights movement. So it's being instrumentalized today to make every voice count and have that voice have the maximum amount of impact. So
mm,
there are some other spaces besides the cultural arena where resistance is taking place,
mm.
not just in on the streets, but hitting companies back in their pocketbooks. So
Yeah.
that said, but got one more little question for you there,
Hmm.
Gary, if you don't mind. I'd like to
Sure.
read an extract from How It Feels to Be Colored Me by Zora Neale Hurston, if I might.
Hmm.
But I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. I do not belong to the sobbing school of Negrohood who hold that nature somehow has given them a low-down dirty deal and whose feelings are all but about it. Even in the helter-skelter skirmish that is my life, I have seen that the world is to the strong, regardless of a little pigmentation more or less. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife.
Mm.
Gary, what is your oyster knife? Bring us home.
Well, it's a good question, and I quote Zora Neale Hurston in the um, essay. I should start by saying that um, kind of my daughter is named Zora after Zora Neale Hurston. So she is a writer who I very much respect. Some of that quote, I do, some of that quote and some of that passage, I do find, the sobbing Negrohood, it grates a little bit in terms of like what she's saying about other people. But the reason why I included that in the piece was because, and I included it after I'd written it. I felt the need to include it because I've had a good career. I wanted to make it clear that um, and I thought it was important to make it clear that this was not a complaint about me. It was an analysis of what I'd had to go through to get to where I was. And that I guess I wanted to forestall the accusation because we all have these voices in our head, the voices that we're trying to escape, the voices that of like, you've done okay, it wasn't so bad for you. And the truth is, I did do okay. But when they throw you in the river and tell you to swim or swim, you can take in quite a lot of water. You can still survive, but you're not the same as when you went in. And so I wanted to make it clear that this wasn't a um, it wasn't a 45-minute whinge, and that um, also that my former employer, The Guardian, which is the only place where I'd really worked for any length of time, it wasn't just an indictment about them. I didn't want it to be limited to me and The Guardian. The Guardian, which I think was probably the best place I could have worked. And where most places wouldn't have, published my stuff. So, um, so there was that, which is a problematic reason for inclusion, but one that I thought was important. And I wanted to do it in a way that kind of didn't throw anybody else under the bus, that just said, look, for me, I've had a good career. I've enjoyed my life. I've been all over the world. I've met really interesting people. And, but these were some of the things I had to navigate. And I felt it was important to do that. And Zora Neale Hurston is a perfect person in that sense because she was a fighter. My oyster knife is partly in old parlance my pen. I think of Seamus Heaney, between my finger and my thumb, the snug pen rests, snug as a gun. I'll dig with it. His poem Digging. That I've always felt that for better and for worse, I had to let my work speak for itself. I had to let my work speak. That it's why you don't usually see me get into it online with people. Because you think what you think. Unless they are lying about me, and even then, usually I just let it go. But that um, uh, that when they come for me, and they, particularly during the Corbyn times, interestingly, much more during the Corbyn times after 9/11, when, I was speaking out in support of minority rights for Muslim people, against the bombing of Afghanistan, there have been moments in my work where people have come for me. And um, that's when you need your oyster knife. And my oyster knife ultimately has to be my work. Otherwise, why are they coming for me? Do you know what I mean? They're not coming for me because I'm some random Joe. They're coming for me. And so, when that does happen, and I know of a couple of people, I don't know them, but I know of them because I see them electronically, who have sat and waited for 20 years or more. Every little thing that I do, they're on it like a bonnet. They're on it like white on rice. And you know, Gary Younge's an academic, and he hasn't published you know, a single piece of work in an academic journal, which is, first of all, not true. But secondly, okay, is that the only way in which you can suggest your intellectual worth? And it's one of those things where I know what the answer to that is, which is that, look, racism does what it says on the packet. It discriminates on grounds of race. Doesn't matter how many honorary degrees I have. Doesn't matter how many books I've written. It doesn't matter how many awards I win. There will still be people who want to take you down. And it's not like there aren't people out there who've got a lot of honorary degrees, written a lot of books, got a lot of awards, who aren't worth having a go at. So none of that is any protection. But if you're black, you will always be an affirmative action hire. It doesn't matter what the judges of the Orwell Prize say, or there's, and I talk about it in the lecture. It's like there's been a lifelong conspiracy to elevate a black left-wing columnist, and that was me. That kind of, all of these people have been working. So I have to be ready, and I wrote an article in defense of rioting in 2005, when the kids in Paris came out, and just said, look, I think it was called Rioting as a Class Act. And I said, is this going to solve the problems? No, I don't think so. Did they have any other options? Doesn't look like it. Is this going to have an effect in terms of how people understand their law? Yeah, there are problems with it. Hypermasculinity, the destruction, the violence, the trauma that's involved, and all of that. It's not unproblematic, but on balance, what else were they supposed to do? And Andrea Levy, who was a close friend of mine and who is Zora's godmother, actually, I mean, she's dead now, but she was Zora's godmother. Um, she wrote to me and she said something like, I really liked your article. I thought it was really important. Watch your back. People are going to be after you. And that's what your oyster knife is for. Now, the thing but for me, it's the work that I don't really have anything else, right? That all I can rebut them with is my work. And the idea of my work isn't to aim it at those people, but to try and keep doing good work, to do the work that I want to do. It comes back to the theme of pigeonhole, to actually insist on my freedom to do the things that I want to do. The other element to that oyster knife thing is that, and I wrote this in a column recently about Claudette Colvin, individuals resist, but resistance is collective. That I It's not something that I can wield on my own. That I need community and company, and so I have to find that. Not to say to people, can you come and protect me and defend me and so on, but to understand yourself as part of a tradition.
Allyship.
Allyship. but kind of some of it being historical allies, some of it being kind of present allies, to understand that, like, I'm not comparing my abilities or capacities with his, but yeah, they came for James Baldwin. They came for Richard Wright. They come for you. They came for Zora Neale Hurston. If you if you're doing something of value in that world of social, people are going to come for you. Don't take it personally, even though it is personal and it's difficult not to take personally. But be ready, and understand what's at stake. And often that means actually kind of doing things, not moderating, but being like you're going to want to be sure about that before you go with that, because they will come for you. You want to, you want to be careful about how you say that, because they will come for you. And this isn't an unknown they. This is a known they. We know who they are. Do you know what I mean? The people who and the movements, the tendencies, the who lie in wait for you to make a mistake, for you to, and we will make mistakes because we're human, to come for you. And at that point, you need people.
That reminds me of something that Gwendolyn Brooks wrote. She wrote, "We are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond."
Mm. Yeah. Um, so we all need one. And coming back to the point I made to Ahmed about that, none of this is a case of like, I'm going to go and just tell it to the man. And like, all of this is strategic, and it has to be. When Obama started in the Senate, and I was in the States then, and people at Nation would go, Obama's not that great. He should have done this about Gaza or this. And my feeling was, look, Black people don't live very long when they are the one or two people in 100, and they go in and they say, right, all of you, like, yeah, the guy's not acting out. Don't expect him to act out. But that's kind of often the people who I might consider allies want you, you haven't said anything about so and so. And I've said to people, no, you know what? I don't think Gaza is a subject for Twitter. Now, some people do, and they're doing that, and that's fine. And I happen to think that I don't have what I would want to say about this will take more than 280 characters. And that's I'm not going to do that. I speak at rallies. I signed a um, a statement. I didn't sign all of them because there's no need to sign all of them. I signed one. Um, I I don't feel like I'm in flight for it, but I don't know Twitter my views on Gaza. And I don't, that is not, I had someone say, yeah, you don't speak out about this. And I said, I've spoken out about it in Trafalgar Square and Hyde Park. How more public could I be? And they said, well, you don't do it on Twitter. And I was like, well, Twitter's not the only place, is it? So um, we have to be careful, and we have to be, we have to be strategic. That's the point. And strategic is not the same as moderate. Strategic, when you're being strategic, you're never going to get it right every time. Sometimes you're going to hold back a little bit earlier than you would. Sometimes you're not going to hold back soon enough. But unstrategic Black people don't live very long. And we're only having this conversation because I'm 30 years uh, uh, into my career, and so we have to choose our battles in the understanding that we won't win every battle, but that if you don't fight, you can't win, uh, and that there's some battles that you're going to keep your powder dry and you're going to come back the next time. And if that seems weak to some people, then tell it to Lenin or Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, all of whom understood the need to be strategic at certain points.
Yes.
I don't. It's not. I don't consider it. I don't consider it a badge of honor, but I don't consider it a badge of shame, and it's certainly been a badge of survival for me.
I'm going to stop us there on that note. Thank you very much for your time and allowing us to come into your world a little bit more and
It's been a
understand.
pleasure.
Oh, for
Thank you very
me, I
much,
can't
Gary.
speak for Ahmed, but I'm just nerding out over here. I'm loving every minute of this.
This was very gratifying, Gary. Thank you so much. This was giving me a lot to think about. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.